Greetings and welcome to another lecture in psychopathology. In this chapter, we're going to be talking about the neurocognitive disorders. Neuro should give you a very good indication that we're talking about the brain, and of course, damage to the brain can definitely cause problems with cognition, with thinking, as well as with emotion and movement and all sorts of other things. Now, because the brain is so important, it has a lot of protection. It is not something that it's really easy to get into. There are several different layers of protection, as a matter of fact. The first layer of protection, of course, is the skull. The skull is some of the hardest bone in the body. It's very difficult to break the skull or crack it open. The skull will stand up to damage that would easily break other bones in the body. So if something can get through the skull, the next layer of protection is actually a lining. It's a lining that is between the skull and the brain. Now, I have to say the brain fits very, very snugly into the skull. There's not a lot of spare room, as you might imagine. And unfortunately, the skull does have some kind of sharp protrusions and such like, but there is a layer in between that serves as a second line of defense. And this is called the dura mater. If you think Dura looks like durable, you're exactly right. This is a layer of tissue that is extremely hard to cut through, even with something as sharp as a scalpel. It simply is, it does not want to give. It does not want to be cut through. The idea being that if something does happen to bash open the skull, that it won't get in through this dura mater to get into the brain itself. Because the brain itself is very fragile. Brain is not very sturdy. It tends to deteriorate very quickly, can be damaged very easily, and of course, once you damage brain cells, for the most part, they don't come back. So the dura mater is the second line of defense. There's several different layers of the dura mater. We're not going to talk about them. You can get them later when you go, if you take a physiological psychology course. But I do want to point out one particular component that are called the meninges. Now, the meninges you may have heard of because on occasion they get infected and they swell up and cause something called meningitis. And meningitis can be very, very dangerous because, as I mentioned before, there's not a lot of space between the brain and the skull. And in meningitis, just like other parts of the body do when they get infected, the meninges start to swell. And they can't push the skull out for the most part because by the time we reach a couple of years of age, our skull bones have all fused. Infants are born actually with their skulls are not necessarily fused, in part at least to be able, skulls can change their shape to fit through the vagina, through the birth canal. A lot of times newborn babies born vaginally have really strange looking skulls. They look like cone heads, and that's part of the reason. Babies have a soft spot where there is really no bone. Need to be careful of it. But generally by a couple of years of age, all of that is seized up. All of that is basically solidified into a good, sturdy, strong skull/helmet. Well, that also means, however, that if you put pressure on that skull, it's not going anywhere. What is going to go somewhere? The brain. And what can happen with meningitis is that the brain can actually be compressed to the point where it's seriously damaged, simply because there's no place else for the meninges to swell and the brain to go. The same thing can happen with a closed head injury. We'll talk about those a little later. Where someone gets a concussion, that can also very often cause the brain to swell and can cause rather significant damage. In addition to the dura mater, we have what's called the blood-brain barrier. Now, in the way that the skull and the dura mater more or less are trying to prevent outside objects from getting into the brain, the blood-brain barrier is named exactly what it is. It is there to prevent things in the blood to get into the brain. And that can be very important. I mean, there are some things in the blood we want to get into the brain. We want oxygen, we want nutrients, that sort of thing. But there are a number of things in the blood that we really don't want to get into the brain. And that can include things like viruses, bacteria and viruses. Because one of the things that your body does, that the cells of your body does, when they become infected, say with a virus, viruses are weird. Because viruses aren't really alive. They have no way to keep themselves alive. What viruses basically are mobile chunks of DNA or RNA, of genes. And they land essentially. They almost look, some of the drawings I've seen almost look like spaceships, alien spacecraft. And they land on a cell, and they'll sometimes drill a little hole and insert their DNA, their genetic material, into that cell, and then they will hijack that cell, not to make more copies of the cell, but to make more copies of the virus. And what cells do when they get hijacked like this is at some point they split open, which A, releases the viruses, which the viruses want, so that they can spread and infect more cells. But B, that also sends an alarm to the immune system to come and take care of this problem. And the way that the immune system takes care of the problem is basically by killing the infected cells. That's part of the whole fever and all the things that go off when you're infected with a virus. Unfortunately, as I said before, brain cells don't recover from this. So you kill brain cells, they aren't replaced. And so it doesn't make a lot of sense to allow viruses to have free roaming inside of brains, where you could wind up losing brain cells all the time. There are some viruses that, by the way, can cross this blood-brain barrier. Some of the herpes viruses can, for instance, I think. I think HIV may be able to. I also think the chickenpox virus, which can come back later and cause shingles. That can. But for the most part, they don't cross. And most of those that do don't really do any damage. If you're a virus, you want to reproduce yourself as much as possible without killing your host, ideally. Because if you kill your host, then you can't reproduce anymore and you're dead. So the ideal virus would infect people and then be able to spread widely without them knowing that they actually have it. Unfortunately, a very good example of this is HIV, where people can be infected for months or years without knowing it and yet can spread it to others during that period of time. At any rate, the blood-brain barrier is there between the brain and the circulatory system in order to restrict the passage of possibly damaging substances. So it also is a layer of protection. Now, I mentioned before that the brain fits very snugly into the skull. There are some open spaces. There's a little bit of open spaces, like between the brain and the meninges. There are passages through the brain that are called the ventricles. There are passages that go through the spinal cord. Essentially, your brain and spinal cord is one unit. It's all covered with the Dura and the blood-brain barrier for the most part. It's all covered with a hard protection, either the skull or the vertebrae, if because the back needs to be able to be moved. And it also all has cerebrospinal fluid in it. Now, what cerebrospinal fluid is, it's basically blood plasma. Blood plasma is the liquid component of blood that carries all the rest of the things in it, the red blood cells, the white blood cells, all that sort of stuff. Except in this case, it doesn't have any protein in it. It is simply a clear, hopefully a clear fluid that circulates back and forth into the blood, and it circulates around the brain and spinal cord. For the most part, as it's produced, it's also being taken out of circulation, which allows the quantity of cerebrospinal fluid to remain the same. There are some disorders like hydrocephalus, which actually means water on the brain. It isn't water on the brain, it's cerebrospinal fluid, where too much cerebrospinal fluid is produced for what is reabsorbed, and it can cause some real problems. Again, it increases the pressure inside the system, which can cause damage to the brain and spinal cord. Okay, let's find this next slide. Now, this is a diagram of the brain. It is in your textbook, and it points out some of the more important parts of the brain. It points out, for instance, we have the hindbrain right here, which is the medulla, the pons, and that includes the reticular formation, that's the hindbrain, as well as the cerebellum is part of the hindbrain. Medulla is things like breathing. The pons is involved in sleep as well as some other things. Cerebellum is for balance and coordination. We have the midbrain in here. The midbrain in here where there's all sorts of very useful things. It's actually up here. It's a little bit of here. We have the forebrain, which is the most part of the brain here, which includes the various lobes, the frontal lobes where personality and such is, the parietal lobe where we have motor functions, the occipital lobe for vision, the temporal lobe bulging out each side for sound, the hypothalamus that's involved in all sorts of important things. This sort of gives you an idea. It's hopefully a review from your general psychology that basically talks about some of the more important structures of the brain. And from here we actually start talking about disorders, starting with an introduction to in terms of delirium. Delirium is a very broad category, as you could probably tell by the definition. It's a disturbance in awareness. Now, this disturbance can be caused by all sorts of things. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So this is really quite vague. It causes confusion. People don't know where they are or don't know who they are. Disturbed concentration. People aren't able to concentrate or focus. Cognitive dysfunction. They may have problems thinking, problems with memory, abnormal movement. Essentially, we've just got some serious problems here in terms of something very broad and very diffuse is going on. Generally, it's found in the elderly as well as in children. You don't see this in a lot in young adults through middle age. Probably because there are more things involved here that may be able to cause this. For instance, one big potential cause, at least, of delirium in the elderly is surgery. A lot of people who go in for cardiac surgery, go in for bypasses and stuff, they don't come out the same as they went in. They've actually declined in some ways. We don't know whether it's because of the surgery, because very often they're on a heart-lung machine. We're seeing this a little bit with people put on ventilators. It's just not the same. But the most common cause is some form of drug intoxication. The person has taken a drug that has caused delirium. And if you remember from the drug chapter, there are an awful lot of drugs that could indeed cause delirium, either in a recreational dose or sometimes in an overdose. We can also have problems with withdrawal, particularly with something like alcohol or the opiates. I mean, there may very well be evidence of delirium for these. Now, with drug intoxication or withdrawal being the most common cause, this should also give you an indication that oftentimes it's reversible. Even when it's linked to something like surgery, a lot of times people may get better over time. Sometimes they don't, but they might. So in many cases, it's reversible. And of course, if it's drug intoxication causing it, then one way to reverse it is to stop taking the drug or to get through the withdrawal. For instance, that is why sometimes people who are going through various types of withdrawal are treated with things like benzodiazepines or treated with depressants in order to reduce this at least somewhat, or neuroleptics that are used actually for schizophrenia. So, I mean, there's delirium, like I said, is very broad, it's very vague. Can be caused by lots of things, tends to be found in the elderly and in children, but it also is often reversible, or it can reduce itself in time.